What if I told you, the faster you chase an avoidant, the faster you lose them. But the moment you stop needing them, they start thinking about you in a completely different way. Not because you changed your looks, not because you became colder, but because you finally stopped activating their fear system. Today, you're going to understand something most people never learn. Avoidants don't fall for intensity. They fall for emotional safety that still feels like freedom. And the psychological turn-ons that trigger them are not what you think. Before we go deeper, comment this: space. Because what you're about to learn only works when you understand one thing first. Connection grows in space, not pressure. Emotional calmness under pressure is one of the strongest psychological signals that affects avoidant individuals because it directly contradicts what they expect from most emotional interactions. Avoidants are often wired through early experiences where closeness felt overwhelming, unpredictable, or emotionally demanding. So their nervous system becomes trained to associate intensity with danger, even if they consciously desire connection. When a situation becomes tense, like delayed replies, unclear communication, or emotional distance, most people react with urgency, anxiety, or over-explanation. That reaction confirms the avoidant's internal expectation that closeness leads to emotional pressure, and it pushes them further into withdrawal. But when someone remains calm instead of reacting, something very different happens in their mind. The lack of escalation creates a sense of safety that they are not used to experiencing in relational dynamics. It signals that the other person is not going to collapse emotionally, demand immediate reassurance, or create guilt-driven closeness. This reduces the avoidant's need to withdraw further because their autonomy feels protected rather than threatened. Emotional calmness does not mean emotional detachment or suppression. It means regulating your internal state so that external uncertainty does not control your behavior or decision-making. In practical terms, it looks like responding without urgency, not over-interpreting silence, and not turning minor distance into an emotional crisis. To an avoidant, this behavior feels unfamiliar but deeply stabilizing because it removes the pressure of having to manage the other person's emotional reactions. They no longer feel responsible for soothing anxiety or fixing emotional tension that they did not create. Over time, this creates a psychological association where your presence equals low threat and high safety. That is significant because avoidant attachment is not activated by how much someone cares, but by how safe it feels to be around them without losing control of their own space. When you remain emotionally steady, even during moments where most people would panic, you shift from being perceived as a potential emotional demand to a secure, grounded presence they can approach without fear of overwhelm. Independence that doesn't ask for permission creates a strong psychological pull for avoidant individuals because it directly removes their core fear of being trapped or emotionally consumed. Avoidants are not simply people who dislike closeness. They are highly sensitive to anything that signals dependency, pressure, or expectations that limit their autonomy. So when they encounter someone whose life feels complete without constant validation or approval, it creates a rare sense of relief. Independence in this context is not about ignoring the other person or acting distant. It is about having a stable inner life that does not revolve around their responses, moods, or availability. When someone makes decisions, follows their goals, and maintains emotional direction without seeking permission or reassurance, it sends a quiet but powerful message. I am here by choice, not need. That distinction is crucial because avoidants are constantly scanning for signs of emotional demand, even subtle ones. If they sense that their attention is required for the other person's stability, they begin to withdraw to protect their own space. But when they observe independence, the pressure system in their mind lowers because there is no implied obligation attached to the connection. This allows curiosity to develop naturally instead of defensiveness. What makes this especially powerful is that avoidants are often drawn to what they cannot control or fully predict emotionally, and independent behavior signals exactly that. A person who has their own routines, interests, social life, and emotional regulation is not easily influenced by distance or inconsistency, which paradoxically makes them more intriguing. It creates a psychological imbalance where the avoidant realizes they are not the center of emotional stability, which reduces pressure and increases respect. Over time, this kind of independence fosters attraction because it feels safe and non-intrusive, while still emotionally available. It also prevents the dynamic where one person chases and the other retreats, which is common in avoidant relationships. Instead of pushing for closeness, independence allows closeness to develop on voluntary terms. This voluntary nature is essential because avoidants only move toward connection when they feel it does not cost them their identity or freedom. When someone consistently demonstrates that their life remains full and meaningful regardless of attention or validation, it creates a slow psychological shift from resistance to curiosity and eventually toward attachment that feels self-chosen rather than forced. Low-pressure communication works on avoidant individuals because it removes the feeling of being emotionally cornered. Avoidants are highly sensitive to communication styles that feel demanding, urgent, or emotionally loaded with expectation. When messages come with implied pressure, like needing immediate replies, constant reassurance, or emotionally heavy follow-ups, the avoidant nervous system reads it as intrusion. Even if the intention is love or connection, their internal response is often resistance because their autonomy feels threatened. Low-pressure communication changes this dynamic completely by allowing space within interaction. It communicates presence without demand, interest without insistence, and connection without emotional chasing. This balance is what makes it psychologically powerful. When someone communicates in a way that does not force immediate emotional response, it creates a sense of control for the avoidant person. They no longer feel like they are being pulled into a conversation they are not ready for or emotionally obligated to maintain at a certain intensity. This reduces internal tension, which is one of the main drivers of avoidant withdrawal. For example, a simple message without follow-up pressure or emotional escalation allows them to engage at their own pace. That autonomy is crucial because avoidants regulate closeness through control of timing and emotional exposure. If they feel rushed, they retreat. If they feel free, they stay curious. Low-pressure communication also removes the fear of emotional consequence. Many avoidants unconsciously expect that delayed replies or reduced engagement will lead to conflict, disappointment, or emotional punishment. When they do not experience that reaction, their nervous system starts recalibrating the relationship as safe. This is where curiosity replaces defensiveness. They begin to associate communication with ease rather than obligation. Over time, this pattern builds trust because trust for avoidance is not built through intensity or frequency, but through the absence of pressure. Another important aspect is that low-pressure communication prevents emotional saturation. Avoidants can become overwhelmed when conversations are too frequent or emotionally dense, even if they care about the person. Giving space between interactions allows emotional processing without overload. It also creates a natural rhythm where engagement feels voluntary rather than forced. This voluntary nature is essential because avoidants respond better to connections they feel they can enter and exit without guilt or conflict. In this environment, communication becomes something they approach rather than avoid, and that shift is what gradually increases emotional openness. Silent boundaries are powerful for avoidant individuals because they communicate self-respect without creating emotional confrontation or pressure. Unlike loud boundaries, which involve explanations, arguments, or emotional intensity, silent boundaries are demonstrated through consistent behavior rather than words. Avoidants are often sensitive to emotional demands, so when boundaries are expressed through lectures or emotional reactions, they can feel controlled or criticized, which triggers withdrawal. But when boundaries are simply lived without emotional escalation, they feel neutral, stable, and non-threatening. This difference is what makes silent boundaries psychologically impactful. When someone sets silent boundaries, they are not negotiating their emotional limits in real time with the other person's approval. Instead, they naturally enforce what they are comfortable with through action. For example, not responding immediately when overwhelmed, not engaging in conversations that feel disrespectful, or stepping back without explanation when energy feels unbalanced. There is no emotional drama attached to it, no attempt to change the other person's behavior through force. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant does not feel attacked or pressured, yet they clearly perceive that the other person has limits that are respected internally. This is important because avoidants are highly observant of emotional regulation in others, even if they do not openly express it. When they encounter someone who does not over-explain, over-apologize, or emotionally chase after setting limits, it signals maturity and stability. It also signals that the person is not dependent on their approval to maintain self-worth. That reduces the avoidant's fear of being trapped in emotional responsibility. They understand that they cannot push past certain boundaries without consequence, but those consequences are not delivered through anger or emotional chaos. Instead, they are delivered through calm withdrawal or redirection, which is much easier for them to process. Silent boundaries also prevent power struggles, which avoidants instinctively avoid. When boundaries are loud or emotionally charged, they often feel like demands, which can lead to distancing. But when boundaries are quiet and consistent, they feel like facts rather than negotiations. This allows the avoidant to adjust behavior without feeling controlled. Over time, this creates respect because they recognize emotional strength without confrontation. It also creates safety because they do not feel emotionally hunted or pressured into compliance. Instead, they learn that closeness exists within clearly defined emotional space that does not collapse under tension. Emotional self-control during distance is one of the most influential psychological signals for avoidant individuals because it directly challenges their expectation that distance will create emotional chaos in the other person. Avoidants are conditioned to anticipate strong reactions when they pull away, such as panic, repeated messaging, emotional confrontation, or guilt-driven attempts to restore closeness. When those reactions appear, it reinforces their need for space and strengthens their withdrawal. However, when the other person remains emotionally steady during distance, it creates a completely different psychological experience that disrupts this cycle. When someone does not react impulsively to distance, the avoidant nervous system begins to register safety instead of threat. Emotional self-control means that even when communication reduces, replies slow down, or engagement feels inconsistent, the other person does not escalate emotionally. They do not overanalyze publicly. They do not chase for immediate reassurance, and they do not turn silence into conflict. This absence of emotional reactivity removes the pressure that avoidants are trying to escape in the first place. Instead of feeling pursued, they feel less emotionally responsible for managing the other person's state. This shift is important because avoidants often carry an unconscious belief that closeness leads to emotional obligation. When distance triggers panic in the other person, it confirms that belief. But when distance is met with calmness, it breaks that pattern. The avoidant starts to notice that their space does not create damage, guilt, or emotional instability in the connection. This reduces their internal resistance and allows curiosity to surface. They begin to wonder why the other person is not reacting the way they expected, which subtly increases psychological engagement. Emotional self-control also communicates strength without confrontation. It shows that emotional stability is not dependent on their presence or validation. This reduces the avoidant's fear of becoming the center of someone's emotional regulation system. Many avoidants withdraw because they feel responsible for managing emotional intensity in relationships. When they see that the other person can remain grounded during distance, that burden is removed. Over time, this creates a sense of reliability in the connection because it does not collapse under emotional uncertainty. This kind of behavior also prevents escalation loops where distance leads to anxiety, anxiety leads to pursuit, and pursuit leads to further withdrawal. Instead, emotional self-control introduces pause and stability into the system. It gives the avoidant space to return on their own terms without feeling pressured or chased. That voluntary return is essential because avoidants only move closer when closeness feels like a choice rather than a reaction to pressure or emotional demand. Subtle appreciation works on avoidant individuals because it delivers validation without creating emotional pressure or expectation. Avoidants often become uncomfortable when appreciation is intense, frequent, or emotionally loaded, because it can feel like an invisible demand for reciprocation or increased closeness. When praise feels overwhelming, it activates their internal defense system, making them withdraw to restore emotional balance. Subtle appreciation avoids this reaction by being calm, grounded, and non-demanding, allowing them to receive positive feedback without feeling trapped in emotional obligation. When someone uses subtle appreciation, they acknowledge qualities or actions in a way that feels natural and low pressure rather than performative or excessive. It is not about constant compliments or emotional amplification, but about quiet recognition that does not ask for anything in return. For example, instead of expressing strong emotional dependence or exaggerated admiration, the tone remains steady and matter of fact. This creates a sense of emotional safety because the avoidant does not feel like they are being placed on a pedestal or made responsible for sustaining someone else's emotional highs. This matters because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional imbalance in relationships. When appreciation becomes too intense, it can create pressure to respond with equal intensity, which they often resist. But when appreciation is subtle, it feels optional rather than obligatory. They can accept it without needing to immediately match it, explain themselves, or deepen emotional engagement beyond their comfort level. This reduces internal resistance and allows positive feelings to accumulate slowly over time instead of triggering withdrawal. Subtle appreciation also builds trust because it does not disrupt the avoidant's need for autonomy. They begin to associate the connection with emotional ease rather than emotional demand. Over time, this creates a quiet reinforcement loop where they feel seen without being emotionally cornered. Unlike intense validation, which can feel overwhelming or suspicious, subtle appreciation feels more authentic and less manipulative to them. It blends into the interaction instead of dominating it. Another important effect is that it encourages voluntary closeness. Because there is no pressure attached, the avoidant is more likely to lean in at their own pace. They do not feel pushed to respond emotionally in a scripted way, so their engagement becomes more genuine. This gradual, pressure-free recognition allows attraction to grow naturally, as their nervous system does not associate the appreciation with loss of control or emotional demand. Space without punishment is powerful for avoidant individuals because it directly rewires their expectation of what distance means in a relationship. Most avoidants are conditioned to associate closeness with pressure and distance with relief, but also with guilt or emotional consequences when the other person reacts negatively. When space is given but followed by anger, emotional withdrawal games, silent treatment, or punishment-based behavior, the avoidance fear system activates even more strongly. They start to feel that every need for distance comes with a cost, which pushes them further away. But when space is allowed without punishment, the entire emotional equation changes. When someone gives space calmly, without guilt, anger, or emotional retaliation, it communicates something very important. Autonomy is respected here. The avoidant does not feel chased during distance, nor do they feel punished for needing it. This creates a psychological environment where separation is not associated with conflict. Instead, it becomes neutral. That neutrality is essential because avoidants regulate closeness through control of emotional intensity. If distance feels dangerous or emotionally expensive, they avoid returning. But if distance feels safe and consequence-free, they are more likely to re-engage naturally. Space without punishment also reduces internal anxiety in the avoidant person. Many avoidants carry an unconscious expectation that pulling away will disappoint or hurt the other person. When that expectation is not met with emotional backlash, it disrupts their defensive narrative. They begin to realize that distance does not destroy connection. This realization slowly lowers their need for extreme emotional self-protection. It also allows curiosity to replace fear because the relationship no longer feels like a trap that tightens when they step back. Another key effect is that it prevents power struggles. Punishing space often creates cycles of chase and retreat, where one person tries to regain closeness while the other resists further. Avoidants instinctively disengage from these dynamics because they feel controlling or emotionally unsafe. But when space is given without punishment, there is no battle to escape. The absence of emotional consequence makes return feel voluntary rather than forced. This voluntary return is crucial because avoidants only move closer when they feel free to do so without emotional pressure or obligation. Over time, this approach builds trust in a very specific way, not through constant closeness, but through consistent emotional safety during distance. The avoidant learns that they can step back without losing respect, connection, or stability in the relationship. That creates a rare kind of security that does not overwhelm their autonomy, and that is what slowly draws them closer instead of pushing them away. Predictable energy, not predictable availability, matters deeply to avoidant individuals because their nervous system is more sensitive to emotional consistency than to constant presence. Avoidants often struggle when emotional reactions are unpredictable, intense, or erratic because it creates a sense of instability that feels unsafe. However, they also resist relationships where someone is always available, always waiting, or always accessible, because that creates pressure and removes the feeling of freedom. So the ideal psychological balance for them is not constant access, but consistent emotional tone. Predictable energy means that your emotional state remains steady, grounded, and stable regardless of external shifts in the relationship. It means they know what version of you they will encounter emotionally: calm, self-regulated, and not reactive. This kind of consistency reduces internal uncertainty for the avoidant, which is important because uncertainty is one of the main triggers of withdrawal. When they cannot predict emotional reactions, they tend to disengage to protect themselves. But when they can predict emotional stability, even if communication is not frequent, they feel safer staying connected. At the same time, predictable availability can actually reduce attraction for avoidance because it removes space. If someone is always reachable, always responding instantly, and always emotionally present on demand, it creates a subtle pressure of expectation. It can feel like the connection requires constant maintenance, which becomes overwhelming. Avoidants prefer relationships where access is not guaranteed, but emotional tone remains stable when access does happen. This allows them to engage without feeling trapped in ongoing emotional obligation. Predictable energy also creates trust over time because it removes emotional surprises. Avoidants are often alert to sudden shifts in mood, intensity, or expectations. When those shifts do not occur, or when they are handled calmly, their defensive system relaxes. They begin to associate the person with emotional safety rather than emotional unpredictability. This does not force closeness, but it removes resistance to it. Another important aspect is that predictable energy allows the avoidant to regulate their own emotional involvement at their pace. They are not forced into emotional spikes or pressured engagement. Instead, they can approach the connection gradually, knowing that the emotional environment will remain stable. This stability becomes more attractive than intensity because it does not threaten their autonomy or overwhelm their system. Over time, this creates a quiet form of attachment where the avoidant feels no need to escape emotional unpredictability because there is none. The relationship becomes something they can return to without emotional preparation or fear of sudden pressure, and that is what slowly increases their willingness to stay connected.